The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet streets of a small town. Nestled among the old cobblestone paths and aging buildings stood Henry's General Store, a humble shop that had been a part of the neighborhood for over 3 decades. The store's owner, Mr. Henry, was a man well past his prime, with silver-streaked hair and deep lines etched into his face by the passage of time. Though his body had grown slower, his mind remained sharp, and his heart, though guarded, still held warmth for the familiar faces that came and went each day. Every morning, before the town fully awakened, Mr. Henry would unlock his store, rearrange the shelves, and set up his modest display of goods. He liked the predictability of it, the steady rhythm of routine that had carried him through the years. The sound of the small shop bell chiming as customers entered, the quiet conversations about weather and local gossip. These were the things that gave him comfort. But lately, something had disrupted that routine. Every day, at precisely 9 a.m., a stray dog would appear at the entrance of the shop. It was a large German Shepherd mix, its coat a mixture of dark brown and black, dusted with hints of gray. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath its fur, and its eyes, deep, intelligent, and unwavering, held a quiet resilience. The townspeople had taken to calling the dog Max, though no one knew where he had come from. What puzzled everyone, especially Mr. Henry, was that Max always arrived with a green leaf in his mouth. At first, Mr. Henry thought it was just a strange coincidence. Perhaps the dog had picked up the habit from somewhere, or maybe it was a simple quirk of behavior. But when day after day, Max showed up with the leaf, placed it neatly at the doorstep, and then sat there waiting. Mr. Henry began to take notice. At first, he shooed the dog away. "Go on now, boy. This isn't a place for strays." But Max never barked, never growled. He simply sat there, his amber eyes locked onto Mr. Henry's with quiet patience. The townfolk noticed too. Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who sold flowers down the street, was the first to bring it up. One morning, as she picked up a loaf of bread, she leaned in and whispered, "That dog's trying to tell you something, Henry." "Oh, and what would that be?" Mr. Henry asked with a chuckle, shaking his head. "You'll never know unless you listen." Her words stuck with him longer than he expected. The next morning, when Max appeared yet again, Mr. Henry did something different. Instead of ignoring the dog or waving him away, he bent down and reached for the green leaf. The moment his fingers brushed against it, Max's tail gave a single, hopeful wag. Something in Mr. Henry's chest tightened. Why is he doing this? What does he want? He sighed, rubbing his temple. All right, what is it that you're after?" Max's ears perked up. He glanced toward the shelf where the dog treats were kept. Mr. Henry raised an eyebrow. "So that's it, huh? You're just hungry." He reached for a small bag of biscuits, opened it, and placed a few pieces in front of Max. The dog hesitated for just a second, then carefully took the food and ate it. But what struck Mr. Henry was how gentle Max was. He didn't snatch it up greedily like most strays would. Instead, he ate with slow, deliberate bites, almost as if he was used to waiting. When Max finished, he gave Mr. Henry a single look, a look filled with something deeper than gratitude, before turning and walking away. As Mr. Henry watched him disappear down the street, a strange feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't just a stray looking for food. There was something more to Max. As the days passed, Max's daily ritual became something of a town mystery. People stopped by the shop not just to buy groceries, but to catch a glimpse of the dog who brought leaves to Mr. Henry. Some even began leaving bits of food for him, scraps of meat, leftover bread, though Max always seemed to prefer the ones given by Mr. Henry himself. Children pointed excitedly whenever they saw Max trotting toward the shop. Street vendors murmured about how he never missed a day, never showed up late. It was as if Max had a purpose. And Mr. Henry, despite his gruff exterior, found himself anticipating Max's visits. Each morning, he'd glance at the clock around 8:55 a.m., pretending he wasn't waiting. Then, at exactly 9 a.m., Max would appear, green leaf in mouth, amber eyes expectant. Mr. Henry would sigh, take the leaf, and offer him food. It became their unspoken agreement. But something still nagged at Mr. Henry. Every time Max finished eating, he left immediately. He didn't linger, didn't wander around like most strays would. Instead, he'd trot off purposefully, as if he had somewhere important to be. Where was he going? And why the leaves? One cold evening, long after the store had closed, Mr. Henry sat in his small apartment above the shop, sipping on a cup of tea. The night was quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. Then, just as he was about to turn in for the night, he heard something outside. A soft scratching at the door. Mr. Henry frowned. He set his cup down and walked over, peering through the small window. His breath hitched. Max was there. But this time, he wasn't carrying a leaf. His posture was tense, his ears pricked forward, and his tail stiff. His eyes, normally calm and patient, held an urgency that sent a chill down Mr. Henry's spine. Something was wrong. Mr. Henry hesitated for only a second before grabbing his coat and stepping outside. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Max let out a single sharp bark, then turned and took off down the street. He didn't look back. He wanted Mr. Henry to follow. Heart pounding, Mr. Henry locked his shop and hurried after him, his old legs struggling to keep up. Max led him through the quiet streets, past dark alleyways and abandoned corners of town. Finally, after what felt like forever, Max stopped in front of an old, run-down house. The moment Mr. Henry caught up, he saw it, a faint whimpering sound coming from inside. Max squeezed through a small gap in the fence, disappearing into the shadows. Mr. Henry's stomach twisted with unease. Something, or someone, needed help. And Max had come to him. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Henry stepped forward, not knowing that what he was about to find would change his life forever. The old wooden gate creaked as Mr. Henry pushed it open, his heart pounding as he stepped onto the overgrown path. The abandoned house before him was barely standing, its windows shattered, its paint peeling, and vines crawling up its walls like nature itself was trying to claim it. But what sent a chill down his spine was the faint, desperate whimpering coming from inside. Max had already disappeared through a narrow opening in the broken fence, his dark fur blending into the night. Mr. Henry hesitated for only a moment before following. As he crouched down and slipped through the gap, his breath caught in his throat. There, nestled in a pile of torn rags and leaves, were 3 tiny puppies, barely more than skin and bones. Their bodies trembled with hunger and cold, their eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Max stood beside them, his body tense, his ears flicking back at the sound of Mr. Henry's footsteps. Then slowly, he stepped aside, as if saying, "Now you see." Mr. Henry knelt down, his heart aching at the sight before him. "Oh, you poor little things," he murmured, reaching out carefully. The puppies were so small, barely the size of his palm, their ribs visible beneath their matted fur. He realized with a pang of guilt that Max had been bringing him leaves not as a trick or a habit, but as an offering, a plea for help, and he had ignored it for days. Mr. Henry swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. All right, let's get you out of here." He shrugged off his coat and gently wrapped the shivering puppies inside, cradling them against his chest. Max gave a low, approving rumble before nudging one of the puppies with his nose, checking on them one last time. Then, without hesitation, he followed Mr. Henry out into the cold night. Back at Henry's general store, Mr. Henry transformed his small back storage room into a makeshift nursery. He found an old wooden crate, lined it with soft towels, and carefully placed the puppies inside. Max immediately curled up next to them, his body a protective shield against the chill. But the puppies needed more than warmth. They needed food. Panicked, Mr. Henry racked his brain. What do you feed newborn puppies? He had no milk, no idea what they even needed. Then he remembered. Dr. Laura Benson. She was the town's veterinarian, a kind woman who had taken care of the stray cats that often wandered into town. Without wasting a second, Mr. Henry grabbed his phone and dialed. After 3 rings, a sleepy voice answered. "Henry? It's past midnight. What's wrong?" "Laura, I need your help." His voice must have held enough urgency because she didn't ask questions. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Dr. Laura arrived exactly when she said she would, her hair still messy from sleep, but her hands steady as she examined each of the puppies. Her expression was grim. "They're severely malnourished, dehydrated too," she sighed. "But we're lucky you found them when you did. A few more days, and she didn't need to finish." Mr. Henry glanced at Max, who was sitting quietly in the corner, watching every movement with sharp, intelligent eyes. Dr. Laura instructed Mr. Henry on how to feed them. She prepared warm formula, using a tiny syringe to gently feed each puppy drop by drop. It was a slow process. Each puppy barely had the strength to swallow, but with every tiny sip, hope grew. "You'll need to feed them every 3 hours, Dr. Laura said, rubbing her eyes, "and keep them warm. Max seems to be doing a good job of that." Henry looked at the German shepherd who hadn't moved from his post. He wasn't just a stray, he was their guardian. For the first time in a long while, something in Mr. Henry's chest softened. "Thank you, Max," he murmured. The dog didn't react. He just watched over the puppies, his puppies, like the silent protector he was. The next morning, the town buzzed with the news. Word spread quickly that Mr. Henry, the grumpy old shopkeeper, had taken in a stray dog and his 3 orphaned puppies. By noon, people started showing up at the store not to buy groceries, but to check on the puppies. Mrs. Carter brought a box of old blankets, saying, "They'll need something soft to sleep on." A group of children pooled their pocket money to buy puppy food, placing the bag proudly on the counter. Even Mr. Thomas, the butcher, who rarely spoke more than 2 words, quietly left a small package of fresh meat outside the door. And through it all, Max never left the puppy's side. Mr. Henry, who had spent most of his life keeping people at a distance, found himself surrounded by warmth. He had always believed the world was a lonely place. But now, as he watched his tiny store become a haven for a family of strays and a town full of unexpected kindness, he wasn't so sure anymore. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the puppies grew stronger. Their once frail bodies filled out, their fur regained its softness, and their eyes, once dull with hunger, sparkled with life. They played, tumbled over each other, barked in excitement whenever Max returned from his short walks outside. The town adored them, and Mr. Henry, despite himself, found his heart growing attached. But he knew one thing. They couldn't stay in the shop forever. They needed homes. Real homes. And so, with a heavy heart, he put up a small handwritten sign outside the store. Looking for loving homes for 3 special puppies. The first puppy was adopted by a kind young woman who had just moved to town. The moment she held the tiny pup in her arms, it licked her nose, making her giggle. "I think he chose me," she said with a smile. The second puppy went to an elderly couple who had recently lost their old dog. The wife wiped her eyes as she cradled the pup, whispering, "You're home now, sweetheart." And finally, the last puppy, the smallest, the shyest, found a home with a little boy who had never had a pet before. When all was said and done, only Max remained. Mr. Henry sat on the shop steps that evening, staring at the German shepherd who had changed everything. "Guess it's just you and me now, huh?" he murmured. Max, as if understanding, gently placed a leaf in Mr. Henry's lap. A deep chuckle rumbled from the old man's chest. He reached out, ruffled Max's fur, and smiled. "Yeah, you can stay." And with that, Max, the once lonely stray who had brought leaves as a plea for help, finally had a place to call home. Life at Henry's General Store had changed in ways Mr. Henry never could have imagined. Max was no longer just a stray. He had become a part of the town. Each morning, as Mr. Henry unlocked the shop, Max would trot out from his sleeping spot near the counter and stretch lazily before sitting by the door. And without fail, just as he always had, he'd pick up a single green leaf from the sidewalk and place it at Mr. Henry's feet. It had started as a plea for help, but now it felt more like a morning ritual, a quiet good morning between two unlikely friends. Customers adored Max. The children who used to race past the store without a second glance now stopped to pet him. Mrs. Carter, the town baker, always brought him a small biscuit from her shop. Even the grumpy postman, who had sworn he wasn't a dog person, began sneaking him pieces of jerky from his pocket. But despite all the attention, Max never stopped being watchful, protective, alert. It was as if he understood his role in the town had grown beyond just being a beloved pet. And one fateful day, he proved just how much he had become a guardian of the community. It was a quiet afternoon. The kind where nothing much happens, the kind of peaceful lull that made small-town life so predictable. Mr. Henry was arranging a new shipment of canned goods when he heard it. A child's scream. The sound cut through the air like a knife. He turned toward the street, his heart pounding. Outside, people were shouting, running. And then he saw it. A small girl, no older than 7, was frozen on the sidewalk, her eyes wide with terror. Racing toward her, out of control, was a speeding bicycle. The boy riding it must have lost control. His face was twisted in panic, his hands desperately gripping the handlebars, but the bike was too fast, too close. The girl wouldn't have time to move. Mr. Henry felt his breath catch, and then Max moved. Like a shadow, he darted forward, his powerful legs propelling him across the street in an instant. The townspeople barely had time to process what was happening. One moment, Max was sitting by the shop door. The next, he was launching himself at the girl, knocking her sideways just as the bicycle screeched past. The girl tumbled onto the grass, shaken but unharmed. The bike, unable to stop, crashed into a lamppost with a loud clang. The boy riding it sprawled onto the pavement, groaning but conscious. The street fell into stunned silence. Then, as if the entire town had been holding its breath, someone cried out, "Is she okay?" The little girl sat up, her lips trembling, but she was completely fine. Max, however, was lying on the pavement, and he wasn't moving. Max, Mr. Henry was already running, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. He knelt beside Max, his hands shaking as he checked for injuries. The German shepherd's body was still, his breathing shallow. Mrs. Carter, the baker, gasped. Someone else murmured, "Is he hurt?" The little girl, Emily, was now crying softly. "The dog saved me," she whispered, clutching her dress. Her mother swept her into a hug, but her wide, fearful eyes never left Max. "Henry," a familiar voice said urgently. Mr. Henry turned to see Dr. Laura Benson, the veterinarian, pushing through the crowd. She must have heard the commotion. Without hesitation, she knelt beside Max, her expert hands checking him over. "He's in shock," she said, her voice calm but serious. "I need to get him to the clinic. Now." Mr. Henry didn't hesitate. He lifted Max as gently as he could and hurried to Laura's car. As they drove off, the entire town stood on the street, watching in stunned silence. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and clean linen, but all Mr. Henry could focus on was Max, lying on the examination table. Laura worked quickly. She checked his ribs, his breathing, his legs. Mr. Henry sat in the corner, clutching his hands together, watching but feeling helpless. After what felt like hours, Laura finally exhaled. "No broken bones," she said, "but he hit the ground hard. He's bruised and he needs rest." Mr. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Max would be okay. Laura smiled gently. "You should stay with him tonight." And so he did. For the first time in years, Mr. Henry closed his shop early. He sat beside Max all night, his fingers gently running through the dog's fur, listening to his steady breathing. For the first time in his life, he realized just how much he cared. Max wasn't just a dog. He was family. The next morning, Mr. Henry carried Max back to the store, and what awaited them there left him speechless. The entire town had gathered. Banners stretched across the street. Max, our hero. Balloons floated near the storefront. People held signs, and Emily, the little girl Max had saved, stood at the front, holding a bouquet of flowers. As Mr. Henry carefully set Max down, Emily stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude. She knelt and placed the flowers next to Max. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Max slowly sat up. His tail wagged. The crowd erupted into cheers. People clapped, some wiped away tears, and Mr. Henry, who had spent most of his life believing he was just an old shopkeeper in a small town, felt something warm and new bloom inside his chest. Max had changed his life, and now he had changed everyone's. That night, as Mr. Henry locked up the shop, Max lay beside him, his head resting against the old man's foot. "Mr. Henry sighed, shaking his head. "You really are something, huh?" Max looked up at him, his brown eyes steady, understanding, and then, just like always, he placed a green leaf at Mr. Henry's feet. A deep chuckle rumbled from Mr. Henry's chest. He picked up the leaf, twirled it between his fingers, and smiled. Yeah, I get it. Another day, another adventure." And as he turned off the lights, he realized something. With Max around, life would never be the same. For weeks after the accident, Max was treated like a true town hero. Strangers stopped by the general store just to see him, bringing treats, belly rubs, and endless praise. Children ran up to hug him. Local newspapers featured his story. Someone even suggested putting up a small statue of Max near the park. Mr. Henry, though still as gruff as ever, couldn't hide his pride. "You've got the whole town wrapped around your paw, huh?" he muttered one evening, scratching Max behind the ears. Max, ever humble, just wagged his tail and placed a green leaf at Mr. Henry's feet. Life in the town was peaceful. Until the day the stranger arrived. It was late afternoon when the door to Henry's general store swung open, and a man in a dark coat stepped inside. Something about him felt off. His face was mostly hidden under a worn-out baseball cap, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, darted around the shop before settling on Max. "Mr. Henry immediately felt uneasy. "Can I help you?" he asked, keeping his tone polite but firm. The man took a slow step forward. His gaze never left Max. "That dog," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Where did you find him?" Mr. Henry narrowed his eyes. He didn't like this. Not one bit. "Why do you ask?" The man hesitated, then forced a smile, a fake one. "Just curious. I think he might be my dog." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. The shop fell into dead silence. Max, who had been lying by the counter, lifted his head. His ears twitched, his body tensed. Mr. Henry felt something twist in his gut. This man was lying, and Max knew it too. "You're mistaken," Mr. Henry said, his voice tight. "Max isn't yours." The man frowned. "Max," he repeated as if testing the name. "That's what you call him?" He took another step forward. Max let out a low, warning growl. The man stopped instantly. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the man chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right, old man, no need to get defensive. It was just a question." But Mr. Henry wasn't fooled. As the man turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back one last time. "Nice store you've got here." His tone was casual, but his eyes held something else. Something unsettling. And then he was gone. That evening, Mr. Henry locked up early. The encounter had left him shaken. Max, as if sensing his unease, stayed unusually close. Even when Mr. Parable, Henry settled into his worn-out armchair with his usual cup of tea, Max sat at his feet, eyes trained on the door. Something about the man's presence didn't sit right, and Mr. Henry had learned long ago to trust his instincts. "Who are you, Max?" he murmured, running a hand over the dog's thick fur. "Where did you come from?" Max said nothing, of course. But in the quiet, the unspoken questions lingered. It was well past midnight when Max suddenly shot up, ears perked, body rigid. Henry woke with a start. "What is it, boy?" Then he heard it. A noise, soft but unmistakable, coming from outside the shop. Someone was there. Max let out a low, rumbling growl. Heart pounding, Mr. Henry reached for the heavy flashlight he kept by his chair. Slowly he made his way to the window and peered through the glass. A dark figure stood near the door. For a long moment, the figure just stood there, unmoving, watching. Then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the night. Mr. Henry gripped the flashlight tighter. Something told him this wasn't over. At dawn, Mr. Henry stepped outside to check the store. That's when he saw it. On the doorstep where Max usually left his green leaf, someone had placed something else. A single, torn dog collar. The tag on it was scratched, but Mr. Henry could still make out 3 letters carved into the metal. REX. His blood ran cold. Someone wanted him to see this, and someone knew exactly who Max used to be. Mr. Henry stared at the collar on his doorstep, his hands clenched at his sides. REX. The letters stared back at him like a ghost from Max's past. Behind him, Max stood tense, his eyes locked on the collar. He knew. This wasn't just some random object. It meant something. And whoever left it behind wanted Mr. Henry to know. The unease from the night before settled into something heavier. Fear. Someone was watching. And whoever they weren't done yet. Mr. Henry sat in his store, staring at the collar for a long time. He ran his thumb over the worn metal tag. The edges were rough, scratched, like someone had tried to erase its history. "Rex," he murmured. "Is that who you used to be, Max?" Max, who had been lying near his feet, lifted his head at the name. There was something in his eyes, recognition. Mr. Henry felt his stomach twist. What had this dog been through before he showed up at the store? And why did someone suddenly care enough to come looking for him now? One thing was certain, Max's past was catching up, and Mr. Henry needed to find out the truth before it was too late. He started small, asking around town, checking with the local vet, even stopping by the animal shelter, but no one had ever reported a missing dog that matched Max's description. Then he made a decision. He called Olivia Reed. Olivia was the town's best journalist. If there was a mystery, she could dig up the truth. When she arrived at the shop, she took one look at the collar and whistled. "That's old." She turned it over in her hands, frowning. Someone tried to scratch off the name, but you can still make it out. She glanced at Max. "You think this belonged to him?" Mr. Henry exhaled slowly. "I think someone wants me to believe that." Olivia's sharp eyes narrowed. "You said someone was outside your store last night?" Mr. Henry nodded. "Didn't get a good look at them, but they left that behind." She was silent for a moment, thinking. Then she pulled out her phone. "I'll check missing dog reports, see if there's anything connected to a Rex." As she scrolled, Mr. Henry caught sight of Max watching her. His eyes were alert. Too alert. It was as if he already knew what they were about to find. It took less than 10 minutes. Then Olivia suddenly froze. Her face paled as she turned the phone toward Mr. Henry. "I think I found him." Mr. Henry leaned in, and his breath caught. There on the screen was a photo of Max, or at least a version of him. His fur had been cleaner back then. He looked stronger, younger. And underneath the photo, in bold black letters, was the name, Rex, missing. The report was dated nearly 2 years ago, and it wasn't from anywhere nearby. It was from another city hundreds of miles away. The more Olivia read, the worse the story got. Max Rex had belonged to someone dangerous, a man named James Holloway, a name Mr. Henry recognized immediately. James Holloway wasn't just some random dog owner. He was a known criminal, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, even suspected involvement in disappearances. And apparently, he had owned Max, or rather, he had used him. Rex had been a guard dog, trained, obedient, loyal to the wrong person. But then, one day, he vanished. No one knew why. But Holloway had been furious, and now, 2 years later, someone had found Max again. Mr. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "So, Holloway's looking for him?" Olivia shook her head. "I don't think so." She pointed at the missing report. "This was never updated. It's old." She scrolled further. "Holloway disappeared over a year ago." That caught Mr. Henry off guard. "Disappeared?" "Yeah." Olivia frowned. No one knows what happened to him. Some say he went into hiding, others think someone took him out. Either way, he's gone. That should have been good news, but it only raised more questions. If Holloway was gone, who was looking for Max now? That night, Mr. Henry sat on his porch watching the quiet street. Max sat beside him, his ears twitching at every sound. The weight of the truth hung between them. Max hadn't just been a stray looking for food. He had been running from something, from someone, and now, after all this time, they had caught up to him. Mr. Henry took a deep breath, reaching down to scratch Max's head. No matter what happens, boy, I'm not letting them take you. Max looked up at him, then did something he hadn't done in weeks. He placed a green leaf gently in Mr. Henry's lap. It wasn't just a gift. It was a promise. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The town of Maplewood felt different the next morning. Mr. Henry sensed it before he even stepped outside. Something had changed. The air felt heavier. The quiet street in front of his shop seemed too quiet, and then he saw it. Right in front of his store, just a few feet from the entrance, a single green leaf. Not one that Max had left. Someone else had placed it there. A message. We know. Mr. Henry's stomach turned. Someone wasn't just watching, they were getting closer. Henry locked the shop early that night. He and Max sat by the window, waiting, watching. Max was unusually still. His ears pricked, his body tense, he knew. And then, footsteps, slow, deliberate. A man appeared on the other side of the street. Tall, dark coat, hands in his pockets. He wasn't from Maplewood. Mr. Henry had lived here long enough to know every face in town. And this was someone new. The man didn't approach. He just stood there, watching. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away. Max let out a low growl. Mr. Henry swallowed hard. The past wasn't just catching up. It had already arrived. The next morning, Olivia Reed was waiting outside his shop. I did some more digging. Mr. Henry unlocked the door and let her in. Tell me. She placed a folder on the counter. Inside were police reports, old newspaper clippings, and a single photo. It was blurry, but Mr. Henry recognized the man from last night. His name's Lucas Kane, Olivia said, tapping the photo. He used to work for Holloway. Mr. Henry frowned. Used to? Yeah, Olivia hesitated. But after Holloway disappeared, Kane started working for someone else. Someone we don't know much about. Mr. Henry felt a sinking feeling in his chest. And now he's here. Olivia nodded. Yeah, which means he's looking for something. Or someone. They both glanced at Max. The dog sat near the doorway, his eyes locked on the street outside. Waiting. That night, Mr. Henry made a decision. He wasn't going to sit and wait for Kane to come to him. He was going to find out what Kane wanted before it was too late. With Olivia's help, he managed to track Kane to a small motel on the edge of town. Room 6. They parked across the street and waited. Then, just after midnight, Kane stepped outside. He lit a cigarette, looked up at the sky, then pulled out his phone. Olivia grabbed a small recorder and clicked it on. They listened. At first, it was just static. Then, I found him. Mr. Henry's heart pounded. He's talking about Max. Kane exhaled slowly. Yeah, he's with some old man. The dog doesn't remember anything yet. There was a long pause. Then a low, sharp voice came through the phone. Make sure he doesn't. A click. The call ended. Mr. Henry and Olivia stared at each other. What the hell did that mean? Back at the store, Mr. Henry paced. Max lay near the counter, his tail twitching in his sleep. He doesn't remember anything, yet. That meant, at some point, he would. And whoever was after him didn't want that to happen. Mr. Henry crouched next to Max, gently stroking his fur. What are they afraid you'll remember, boy? Max stirred, his paws twitching. And then, for the first time since Mr. Henry had taken him in, Max whimpered in his sleep. Not just a soft sound, a terrified, broken sound, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Mr. Henry's chest tightened. Max was remembering, and it was hurting him. The next morning, Mr. Henry knew they were running out of time. He packed a small bag, threw some food in for Max, and locked up the store. He wasn't going to sit and wait. They needed answers. But as he turned onto Main Street, he felt it again, that cold, sinking feeling. And then, a dark figure stepped into the road, blocking his way. Lucas Kane. He stood there, smirking, like he knew exactly what Mr. Henry had been planning. There was nowhere left to run. Max let out a low, warning growl. Kane's smirk widened. "We need to talk." Lucas Kane stood in the middle of the road, blocking their path. "We need to talk." Mr. Henry gripped the steering wheel tighter, his heart pounding. Max let out a low growl, ears flat against his head. Kane smiled. "Relax, old man, I'm not here to hurt you." Mr. Henry didn't trust him, not for a second, but he also knew one thing. Running wouldn't help. He pulled over. Kane took his time walking to the car, hands still in his pockets. When he reached the window, he leaned in slightly. "You've got something that belongs to us." Mr. Henry's grip tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kane's smirk didn't fade. "That dog." Max snarled. Kane didn't even flinch. "He knows something important, and we can't have that." Mr. Henry kept his face neutral, but inside, his mind was racing. They were afraid of Max, of what he might remember. That meant Max had seen something they didn't want getting out. Kane's voice dropped to a whisper. "Give him to me, and I'll make sure you don't get caught in the crossfire." Mr. Henry clenched his jaw. "Not a chance." Kane sighed, straightening. "I figured you'd say that." Then he tapped the roof of the car twice and stepped back. "See you soon, old man." And just like that, he walked away. But the warning was clear. They were out of time. That night, Max couldn't sleep. He paced by the door, restless. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of something dark flickered in his mind. Blood, a struggle, and a voice, one he couldn't quite place, calling his name. "Max, run." He opened his eyes, panting. Mr. Henry sat nearby watching. "You're remembering, aren't you?" he asked softly. Max let out a small whine, lowering his head. He didn't want to remember, because deep down, he knew the truth was painful. But now there was no choice. Whatever he had seen, it was the reason people wanted him gone. By morning, Mr. Henry had made a decision. They couldn't stay in Maplewood, not until they figured out the whole truth. They had to leave. He packed a bag with food, water, and enough supplies for a few days. Max stayed close to his side, ears alert, tail low. They didn't say goodbye to anyone, just slipped out before the town had fully woken up. But as they turned onto the main road leading out of town, a black SUV pulled out behind them. Mr. Henry's hands went cold. They were being followed. The SUV stayed close as they drove down the long, empty road. Mr. Henry knew it was only a matter of time. And then, the SUV sped up, pulled alongside them, and swerved, slamming into the side of the truck. The impact sent them skidding off the road. Max barked in alarm as Mr. Henry fought for control. The truck crashed through a fence, coming to a jarring stop in a field. Dust filled the air. Mr. Henry's chest burned from the seatbelt's grip. His hands shook, and then he heard the car doors open. They were coming. Max growled, his body tense, muscles coiled, ready to fight. Mr. Henry took a deep breath, gripping the door handle. This was it. No more running. Lucas Kane stepped out of the SUV, a few other men behind him. "I warned you." Mr. Henry got out of the truck slowly. "Then tell me the truth. What did Max see?" Kane chuckled. "Does it matter?" Mr. Henry didn't back down. "It does to me." Kane sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, you want to know?" He glanced at Max. "Your dog used to belong to someone who got too close to the truth. A journalist. Someone who thought they could expose things they weren't supposed to." Mr. Henry's heart clenched. "Max's owner?" Kane smirked. "They killed him, and they thought they killed the dog too." Max let out a low, threatening growl. Kane continued. "But somehow, your mutt survived, and now that he's remembering, that's a problem." Everything clicked. Max had witnessed a murder, and the people responsible wanted to make sure no one ever found out. Kane pulled out a gun. "I can't let you leave with him." Max lunged. The sudden attack threw Kane off balance. He fired, but Max was faster. He sank his teeth into Kane's arm, making him drop the gun with a yell. The other men rushed forward, but headlights flooded the field. A second later, police sirens filled the air. Olivia Reed's car came skidding to a stop. She had brought help. "Drop your weapons," an officer shouted. Kane hesitated, then made a run for it. But Max was faster. He tackled Kane, pinning him to the ground until the police swarmed in. It was over. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Kane and his men were arrested. Olivia's reports exposed everything. Max's old owner, a journalist named Eric Dawson, had been murdered while investigating corrupt officials. His death had been covered up, and the only witness left alive? Max. The town of Maplewood was shaken, but justice had finally been served. Max had survived against all odds, and now he had a home. With Mr. Henry, the old man looked down at the dog sitting beside him on the shop's front steps. "Looks like we're stuck with each other, huh?" Max wagged his tail. Then, just like every morning, he placed a green leaf at Mr. Henry's feet, a habit he would never forget, a symbol of everything they had been through together. A silent thank you. Mr. Henry smiled, reaching down to ruffle his fur. "You're welcome, boy." And just like that, the shopkeeper and the stray dog who had saved each other watched the sun rise over Maplewood. Together.